first presenter is Miss Sarah Hoagland. And Sarah stepped up, I guess, so it's very fortunate that we have Sarah and her ability to step forward and be a part of this panel. Sarah Hoagland is from the Laguna Pueblo. Is a recent graduate from the Friend School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and was recognized as the Doris Duke Conservation Fellow in 2010. She currently works for the U.S. Forest Service at the Southern Research Station in Asheville, North Carolina. She pioneered a wildlife linkage project in Santa Barbara and has hopes of pursuing her PhD in wildlife conservation. And I think in Sarah Hoagland's future, we're hoping that it's going to be in the teaching realm. So, great. Help us welcome Sarah Hoagland.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jen, for the introduction. I actually might ask for somebody's help up here just to sort of reorganize before we get started. Are you guys okay with looking at Gary's slide for a little bit? I actually don't have a presentation together because I was asked on Tuesday night. I'll really mainly just be speaking. All right, so he said just to give more of an introductory, and we'll go into some of the questions later. But thank you again for asking me to come present today. It really is an honor to stand up here with folks like Gary, and to follow Gary, though, is quite the challenge. So we'll see. He's quite the whiz and has a lot of great information, so I'll do my best. But wanted to thank the local tribe and all the folks that have been involved with planning the committee. I know that it's a lot of work in hosting these events and organizing, so thank you to all of them. But as Jim was kind of mentioning in my introduction, I do have more of a wildlife background. My bachelor's is in ecology, and I actually wanted to be a marine biologist or a zoologist when I was a little kid, so forestry wasn't really a huge part of my upbringing. But my master's thesis, though, focused on oak woodland ecology and management in California, and so I started developing, more of those skills, and then now I'm in a PhD program at NAU in Flagstaff in the School of Forestry, and so now I'm, fully immersed in it, and coming from that background, I think is sort of unique because there was a point in time where I really was not only trained, but I kind of thought that the whole concept of cutting trees, was like, oh, how could you do that? That can't be right. We can't cut trees. But now I'm looking at my project, actually saying we probably need to cut more trees and maybe cut more trees around spotted owls. So that's really shaking people up. And to kind of go through that whole transition and kind of coming from that really far side where, how can we even imagine cutting down a tree to help wildlife? So it's just really kind of interesting going through that whole stage and understanding why there are so many misconceptions out there still, not only just in our universities and our educational systems, but just with our general public too, and trying to understand kind of what we're all talking about here with sustainable forest management and restoring landscapes. So I do think that, at least I can kind of speak to that. But just a little bit of background, and I do have some comments on the questions, but maybe we'll get back to that later. Okay, great. Do that as a panel. Okay, well, yeah, I think then I'll just leave it at that, and I'm really happy to be here and wanted to thank you all and looking forward to the panel and the discussion following.
Our next member of the panel is Russ Hoflich. Russ Hoflich is the Vice President and Senior Policy Advisor for the Nature Conservancy's Restoring America's Forest Program. He is responsible for advancing strategies to rebuild resiliency into 200 million acres of the American federal forest. In 1981, Russ became a founding director of the Nature Conservancy's early program based in East Hampton, New York. In 1986, he became State Director of the Nature Conservancy's Oregon operation. He is very conservation background. Russ is today responsible for advancing a united 23-state forest conservation strategy supported by 7 staff focused on rebuilding resiliency into America's most imperiled forest. Based in Oregon, Russ presently serves on the Oregon Global Warming Commission Federal Forest Land Implementation Work Group in Oregon Department of Forestry and Oregon Department of Energy Forest Biomass Work Group, and a legislatively mandated team charged with designing a new collaborative funding model to escalate climate resiliency treatment on 9 million acres of fire-adapted National Forest Service land in the state of Oregon. Russ earned his BA in Biology and a BS in Environmental Science at Southampton College, now Stony Brook University, and has a Master's in Environmental Management from the C.W. Post campus of Long Island University. So please help me welcome Russ.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I'll just give you a little bit of background beyond my resume there. I was a son of a forester in salmon country. My mother was from New England. She was in the eel country, and the connection to the land and waters of Maine and New Hampshire, as well as my father's coastal connections to salmon, really has helped to shape my career, my passions, my grounding and connection to the land and waters. And Gary, I just want to say that in your presentation, you talked about that map of the history was really powerful. And with a very high degree of humility, I just want to say that from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, our history is in that last little second of the historic preview. With 63 years of history, we have helped to shape the acquisition and protection of roughly, with partners in the land trust community, about 40 million acres. Then you would look at the federal estate, just in the Forest Service alone, and you add to the portfolio of Indian country another 200 million acres. We have some of the most biologically diverse assets in the control of all three. How we then turn around and say the knowledge gained and the perspectives of all the united bodies can be brought together to look beyond our own borders to be able to impact the remainder is really essential, and it's really the challenge of our time if we're going to protect the lands and waters that is so critical to all of us. And I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. I'm going to introduce a gentleman that needs no introduction. Our own president of Intertribal Timber Council, Philip Rigdon, and the Deputy Natural Resource Director for the Great Yakima Nation.
I just want to start off, and we have Jim Durgalo on two panels to be the moderator. This is a new milestone of the Intertribal Timber Council. I do thank you for that. This morning I gave part of our conversation and what's going on in the country. And this conversation, we're grateful to have such a diverse group of folks, and we thank Sarah for stepping up. But and so I'm not going to go too much into, and we'll go into the discussion. But the role and the folks that work here, this is an exciting conversation, but it's a challenging one because of how large the real problem is across the landscape. How can we get there to achieve something that is more permanent, and how we deal with those things. And I do think any country is active. We react and respond to these things. And I think there's a good opportunity to look at the models on how we can achieve these things. We have great people that work on the ground and really get things done. And so I just want to make sure that with that I'll go through the questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our last member of the panel is James Hubbard. Late in 2005, James Hubbard stepped into the position of U.S. Forest Service Deputy Chief for State and Private Forestry, with responsibility for fire and aviation management, national fire plan, cooperative forestry programs, forest health protection, conservation, education, urban and community forestry, and the Office of Tribal Relations. Between November 2004 and October 2005, Mr. Hubbard served as the Director of the Office of Wildland Fire Coordination with the Department of Interior. In this position, he had oversight for the implementation of the National Fire Plan and activities of the 5 land managing bureaus for forest fire prevention, mitigation, and partnerships with communities, tribes, and stakeholders. Jim was a member of the Colorado Forest Service for over 34 years before coming to federal service in 2004. He served as a Colorado State Forester from 1984 to 2004, where he oversaw 8 million acres of private and state forests. Please welcome James Hubbard.
Thank you. I got to work on that intro. I keep trying to get those things reduced, so and the ones that get sent out surprise me every time. But thanks for having me. Good crowd. Hope we have a lot of interaction, which we'll get to in a minute. If you'll notice, the panelists, Phil and I have these things, pieces of paper that we write on. Those other two are a little more advanced. They've got some computers, so watch out. They can pull up any kind of information. But a little bit on Gary's presentation. What I deal with in Washington in the policy area is very much fits into those buckets that you talked about, those 4 buckets. And the only one I ever get to talk about much is the important and urgent. So if it isn't important or urgent, that Congress that you heard described this morning isn't really going to do much with it. So when we talk about our challenges, that's what has to fit. Our challenges on the landscape are much broader than that. Many things are important but don't appear as urgent to decision makers. But there are some I think we can capitalize on and make some decisions. The other part of that, important and urgent, is the next question, if you even get an audience, is prioritize. What's the highest priority? Where can you take some action, and what kind of action that will make a difference? And that's then becomes the discussion of the priority and the concept of making a difference. I'd like to get into this collaboration discussion, but I'll wait and let that take shape based on the audience. And I certainly want to get into a discussion of cohesive strategy of hazardous fuels. In the Forest Service budget, we haven't seen major increases anywhere in a long time. This last fiscal year, we did see an increase in hazardous fuels. So we went from $300 million to $355 million. I kept the $55 million, and I didn't allocate it the way we've been doing business in the past, because I too agree that our future is not going to be exactly the way we have done things. So how do we bridge that change and start thinking about things in a different way across the landscape, with communities as a consideration, and how we deal with all of that? That's part of what I'd like to get into a discussion about with you, and how we start to make that kind of a change in dealing with a larger landscape that considers communities. So, Jim, are you going to moderate this? Jim, you're going to moderate this, so let it begin.